Before you scroll past this, I need you to stay for just 60 seconds because what I'm about to show you changes everything you thought you knew about the slave trade. Not a little, everything. Most people think the transatlantic slave trade was about one thing: cheap labor. Millions of African bodies shipped across the ocean to build plantations and economies. That is the story every textbook tells, and that story is only half true. Because there is another layer, a layer that powerful institutions spent centuries trying to bury. A layer hidden inside a document, a real physical document that was locked away in a Portuguese royal archive for over 400 years. And when researchers finally cracked it open, they didn't find a shipping manifest, they didn't find a labor contract, they found a list, a hit list, with names, with bloodlines, with specific African kingdoms marked for destruction. Not because of their land, not because of their gold, but because of who they were descended from. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you are going to see the African continent and the history of slavery with completely different eyes. Let's go back, way back, to the early 1500s. Most Americans, when they picture Africa at this time, picture a continent of isolated villages, no kingdoms, no written records, no organized power. That image is not history. That image is propaganda. In the early 15th century, West and Central Africa was home to some of the most sophisticated political structures on the planet. The Kingdom of Benin, in present-day Nigeria, had walls that archaeologists now estimate were 4 times longer than the Great Wall of China. The Mali Empire had already produced Mansa Musa, a king so wealthy that when he made his pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, he accidentally crashed the gold market of the entire Mediterranean world just by spending his own personal money. The Songhai Empire had universities, real universities. In Timbuktu, scholars were studying astronomy, law, mathematics, and theology, while Europe was still burning people at the stake for asking the wrong questions. This is the world that the Portuguese sailed into, and here is what most people do not know. The Portuguese were not the first Europeans to arrive, randomly stumbling upon Africa. They were sent, with specific instructions from the highest levels of the Catholic Church and the Portuguese crown. And those instructions were not simply, "Go find people to work our fields." The instructions were far more specific than that, and far more disturbing. To understand what the Portuguese were doing, you have to understand who Portugal was. In 1492, Spain expelled its Jewish population in what became known as the Alhambra Decree. Hundreds of thousands of Sephardic Jews were forced out. Many fled to Portugal. Many converted under pressure. Many scattered across North Africa and into sub-Saharan Africa over the following generations. This is documented history, not conspiracy. The descendants of those scattered communities brought with them something the Portuguese crown became obsessed with tracking: bloodlines. Specifically, bloodlines connected to the ancient tribe of Judah. Now let me be very clear here. This is where history gets complicated, and I want to be careful and accurate. I am not making a claim about religion. I am not making a claim about race. I am presenting what historians and archaeologists have documented, which is that the Portuguese crown in the 15th century was deeply invested in locating, cataloging, and in some cases eliminating specific royal and priestly lineages that had survived from ancient Near Eastern communities and had migrated into sub-Saharan Africa over centuries. The reasons they gave were religious and political. The methods they used were devastating, and the evidence is written down. Now let's talk about the document itself. And here I want to be precise, because this video deals with real historical research, not folklore. Portuguese colonial archives, particularly those housed in the Arquivo Histórico Ultramarino in Lisbon, contain thousands of documents from the 16th century that have never been fully translated into English and have never been made accessible to mainstream audiences. Among these documents are royal dispatches called regimentos, which were detailed instruction sets given to Portuguese captains before they departed on voyages along the African coast. Some of these regimentos were purely commercial, but a significant number, particularly dating from the 1530s through the 1580s, contained something unusual. They contained ethnographic intelligence, meaning the Portuguese crown already had information about specific communities, specific lineages, and specific religious structures within African kingdoms before the ships ever left port. Where did they get this intelligence? From missionaries, from Jewish converts known as conversos, who had family and trade connections deep inside Africa, and from a network of informants that had been building for decades before the large-scale slave trade began. Let me ask you something, and I want you to think about this honestly. If this was purely about labor, why did the Portuguese need a list of bloodlines? Why did they need maps of priestly lineages? Why did their documents specifically distinguish between those fit for labor and those who must not be allowed to reproduce? Think about that. Now, let's address the part of this story that most people have never been taught, the connection between ancient Judah and the kingdoms of West and Central Africa. This is not mythology. This is documented through multiple independent lines of historical evidence. First, the Lemba people of southern Africa. The Lemba are a Bantu-speaking people who have maintained for generations that they are descended from ancient Semitic traders who migrated from the north thousands of years ago. For a long time, historians dismissed this as oral mythology, until 2000, when genetic studies published in the American Journal of Human Genetics confirmed that Lemba men carry the Cohen modal haplotype, a specific genetic marker found predominantly in Jewish priestly families. The DNA matched. The oral tradition was correct. Second, the Beta Israel of Ethiopia, also known as the Falasha, a Jewish community in Ethiopia that maintained Hebrew religious practices, observance of Shabbat, dietary laws, and priestly structures, completely isolated from the rest of the Jewish world for potentially over 2,000 years. Their origin is still debated among scholars, but their existence is not. Third, and this is where it gets deeply interesting, historians have documented that certain West African kingdoms, particularly in the region of present-day Nigeria, Benin, and Ghana, maintained religious and legal codes that showed striking structural similarities to ancient Hebrew law. Circumcision practices, new moon festivals, priestly castes with hereditary roles, purification rituals that mirror those described in ancient texts. Now, I want to pause here. I am not telling you what to believe about where these practices came from. There are multiple academic theories: independent development, ancient trade contact, migration patterns, all are on the table. What I am telling you is this: the Portuguese crown believed these connections were real. They documented those beliefs, and they acted on them. Before I go further, I want to know what you think. Drop in the comments. Did you ever learn any of this in school? Because I didn't, and I have a feeling neither did you. Among the most closely guarded documents in the Portuguese colonial archive are a series of charts drawn up between roughly 1540 and 1760 that do not look like ordinary navigation maps. Ordinary navigation maps of this era showed coastlines, currents, and port depths. These charts showed something different. They showed the interior of Africa divided not by geography, but by genealogy. Specific regions were labeled with terms that historians have identified as references to tribal lineages. Certain communities were marked with what researchers have translated as "of the old blood," a phrase that appears repeatedly in correspondence between Portuguese governors and the royal court. Other communities were marked with phrases indicating they were considered religiously dangerous, meaning their priestly or royal authority was seen as a direct ideological threat to Portuguese Catholic expansion. And the communities marked as most dangerous were consistently located in the same zones that experienced the most violent and targeted slave raids in the following decades. Not random coastal raids, targeted. Interior expeditions, going hundreds of miles inland, past easier targets to reach specific villages, specific families, specific lineages. Now let me ask you a question that no textbook will ask. If you were hunting for labor, why would you march past dozens of coastal villages to travel deep into the jungle for a specific group of people? You wouldn't, unless you weren't hunting for labor, unless you were hunting for something else entirely. Let's be precise about how this worked, because this isn't just theory, this is documented in the mechanics of the trade itself. Historians have long noted something puzzling about the earliest phase of the Atlantic slave trade, particularly the Portuguese phase from roughly 1441 to 1600. The pricing structure didn't make sense if this was purely about labor. Certain categories of enslaved people commanded prices 10 to 20 times higher than others, not because of physical strength, not because of agricultural skill, but because of what the Portuguese documents called qualidade, meaning quality or character, which historians have traced to mean lineage and social rank. Why would a plantation economy pay a premium for social rank? Plantations don't care about titles. Plantations care about bodies. But if your goal is the systematic elimination of a leadership class, if your goal is to remove the religious and royal authority from specific communities, then you need to make sure you're capturing the right people. And that is exactly what the pricing structure reflects. The most expensive categories of enslaved people in early Portuguese records were described not by physical characteristics, they were described by social and hereditary role. Priests, chiefs, and members of royal families. This is not speculation. This is in the ledgers. This is in the ship manifests. Historians have had this data for decades. The question is, why isn't it in the textbooks? I want to hear from you in the comments. Do you think the suppression of this information is accidental, or do you think it's deliberate? No wrong answer. This is exactly the kind of question historians fight about. Let me know where you stand. Now let's go deeper, because to understand why Portugal was so specifically focused on African bloodlines and priestly lineages, you have to understand the ideological framework of 1500s Catholic Europe. This was the era of the Inquisition, the era of limpieza de sangre, which translates literally as purity of blood. This was an actual legal doctrine in Spain and Portugal that determined a person's rights, religious standing, and social status based on their ancestry. If you had Jewish or Muslim ancestry, even generations back, you were suspect. You could be investigated, you could lose property, you could be imprisoned. Now take that same obsession with bloodlines and religious authority and point it at Africa, at communities that maintained ancient religious traditions, at priestly lineages that the Portuguese believed were descended from the very same source that their own Inquisition was trying to eradicate in Europe. Suddenly, the picture becomes very different. This wasn't just economics. This was a continuation of a religious campaign, a campaign that had already expelled Jews from Spain, already forced conversions across Portugal, already burned manuscripts in Granada, and was now extending itself across the ocean, into Africa, targeting communities that the Portuguese crown believed carried the same dangerous bloodlines and the same dangerous religious authority. The historian Yosef Chaim Yerushalami, in his landmark work on Sephardic history, documented the remarkable survival of Judaic practice across scattered communities across Africa and the Americas. He did not frame this as mythology, he framed it as historical tragedy, the deliberate hunting and erasure of communities precisely because of their cultural and genealogical identity. That is the context within which the 1550 Portuguese documents must be read. Let's name some of the specific kingdoms that historians believe were directly targeted. First, the Kingdom of Nri, in present-day southeastern Nigeria. Nri was one of the oldest and most sophisticated kingdoms in West Africa, and unusually, it was led not by a warrior class, but by a priestly class. The Eze Nri was a spiritual king, a ritual authority, whose power came not from military force, but from religious legitimacy. Nri had an explicit prohibition against slavery within its own borders, documented by anthropologists, and its priests were known across a wide region as the ultimate arbiters of ritual purity and social order. This kingdom was systematically targeted in some of the most violent slave raids of the 16th and 17th centuries. The anthropologist M.A. Onwejogwu, in his 1981 study of the Igbo Ukwu civilization, documented that the destruction of Nri's religious infrastructure correlated almost precisely with the escalation of Portuguese slave raids in the Niger Delta region. Second, the Kingdom of Congo. Now, the Kingdom of Congo is better documented in Western history because it actually had diplomatic relations with Portugal. But what is rarely taught is that within the Kingdom of Congo, there were specific priestly clans, known as the Nanga, whose authority the Portuguese found particularly threatening, not politically, religiously. Portuguese Jesuit missionaries wrote extensively about the difficulty of converting Congolese communities because the existing religious authority was too deeply entrenched, too organized, too legitimate in the eyes of the people. And the records show that the targeting of specific Nanga lineages was discussed at the highest levels of Portuguese colonial administration, not just as a religious inconvenience to be preached away, but as a political problem requiring a more permanent solution. Third, the Kingdom of Dahomey in present-day Benin. Dahomey is often taught in American schools as a kingdom that participated in the slave trade, and this is true. But what is rarely taught is what was happening inside Dahomey before and during that participation. Historians have documented that Dahomey's royal lineage maintained traditions including royal naming ceremonies, purification rites, and ancestral veneration practices that showed remarkable structural parallels with ancient Near Eastern religious traditions. Whether those parallels came from ancient contact, from shared human religious development, or something else entirely, is genuinely debated. What is not debated is that the Portuguese were intensely interested in mapping and controlling those religious structures. Here's a question I want you to sit with, and please debate this in the comments because historians genuinely disagree here. If West African kingdoms maintained religious and legal structures similar to ancient Hebrew traditions, is that more likely because of ancient migration and contact, or independent development, or something else? Tell me what you think. This is the kind of question that archaeologists and historians are actively arguing about right now. I want to know where you land. Now let's talk about why this story is not in your history textbook. And I want to be fair here. There are multiple reasons, and not all of them are sinister. Reason 1. Language barrier. The vast majority of Portuguese colonial documents have never been translated into English. The archive in Lisbon contains tens of millions of pages of documents. Most of them remain accessible only to researchers who read 16th century Portuguese, which is a very small community. When something isn't translated, it doesn't enter the mainstream conversation. That's not a conspiracy, that's a resource problem. Reason 2. Disciplinary silos. The researchers who work on Portuguese colonial history are often different from the researchers who work on African religious history, who are different from the researchers who work on Sephardic Jewish history. The connections between these fields require someone to sit at all three intersections at once, which is rare, difficult, and often academically thankless work. Reason 3, and this one is more uncomfortable. The narrative of the slave trade as purely economic is easier to process than the alternative. If the slave trade was purely about labor and greed, it was monstrous but comprehensible. Greed is something humans understand. But if the slave trade was also, at least in part, a deliberate campaign to identify, capture, and eliminate specific hereditary communities because of who they were descended from, that is a different category of crime entirely. That moves it from exploitation into something that modern international law would categorize differently. And that categorization has implications, legal, moral, and political, that many institutions would prefer not to examine. I'm not telling you what conclusion to draw. I'm telling you the question exists, and it deserves to be asked. Now, I want to be honest with you about something. Not every historian agrees with the framework I've been laying out in this video, and I think you deserve to hear the other side. There are serious scholars, serious, rigorous people who argue that the targeted bloodline theory overstates the organizational coherence of the early Portuguese slave trade. Their argument goes like this: the slave trade was chaotic, opportunistic, and driven by local African intermediaries as much as by European demand. Portuguese captains often had limited knowledge of the interior. The pricing differentials for high-status individuals reflected market value within African political economies, not a Portuguese conspiracy to eliminate specific lineages. And the religious framing, the idea that Portugal was on a systematic campaign against Judaic bloodlines in Africa, goes beyond what the documents can definitively prove. These are fair arguments. They deserve respect. What I would say in response is this: even if the trade was not organized as a top-down conspiracy, that does not mean the outcomes were random. Even if individual Portuguese captains were acting on greed rather than ideology, that does not mean the ideological framework didn't exist at the highest levels. History is rarely pure conspiracy or pure chaos. It is usually something more complicated. Institutions with ideological agendas operating through actors motivated by profit and fear, with results that serve the institutional agenda whether or not every individual intended them. The documents exist, the pricing structures exist, the geographic patterns of rating exist. The question of how to interpret them is genuinely open, and that is exactly why this story matters, because it's a story we haven't finished telling yet. Let's come back to the human level, because at the end of all this, the archives, the documents, the theories, there are people, millions of people, ripped from their homes, separated from their languages, their families, their traditions, transported across an ocean. And here is what the archaeological and genealogical record shows. The communities that were most heavily targeted in the early Portuguese slave raids were disproportionately communities with strong priestly or royal structures. The communities that suffered the highest rates of cultural erasure were disproportionately those with the most developed religious legal systems. Whether that was intentional policy or the unintended result of targeting high-status individuals who commanded higher prices, the outcome was the same. The most culturally and religiously organized communities were the most completely dismantled. Their descendants arrived in the Americas stripped of language, of names, of genealogy, deliberately stripped, because in the Americas, an enslaved person who did not know their name could not claim a lineage. An enslaved person who did not know their language could not organize around their traditions. An enslaved person who did not know their history could not assert a legal or moral claim based on that history. And so the erasure, whether it was planned from the beginning or whether it was maintained because it was convenient, the erasure was thorough, and it lasted generations, and in many ways it is still ongoing. But here is where the story becomes something other than tragedy, because the erasure was not complete. It was never complete. Oral traditions survived. Genetic records survived. Cultural practices survived. Hidden, disguised, maintained in secret across 400 years of suppression. The Gullah Geechee communities of the American South maintained linguistic and cultural connections to West African traditions that researchers are still actively documenting. The Candomblé and Candomblé-derived religious traditions of Brazil preserved African priestly structures that scholars have traced back to specific West African kingdoms. The oral histories of communities in Haiti, Jamaica, and throughout the Caribbean maintain detailed genealogical traditions that predate their arrival in the Western Hemisphere. And today, for the first time in history, genetic genealogy technology is allowing descendants of enslaved people to trace their origins to specific regions and, in some cases, specific communities with a precision that was impossible even 20 years ago. What researchers are finding is that the genetic diversity of the African American population reflects something very specific: a concentration of lineages from precisely the zones that the Portuguese documents identified as priority targets. Not random, not evenly distributed across the continent, concentrated in the exact places the maps pointed to. That is not proof of everything I've told you today, but it is not nothing either. So what do we do with all of this? Here is what I believe, and I want to be clear that this is my perspective, offered for your consideration, not as the final word. History that has been hidden does not stop shaping the present. It shapes it from underneath, invisibly. And one of the most powerful things any person can do, black, white, Latino, Asian, any background, is to refuse to accept the simplified version of history when the complicated version is available. The simplified version of the slave trade says Europeans wanted free labor. Africans were unlucky enough to be available. Terrible things happened. The end. The complicated version says there were specific communities with specific identities that were specifically targeted. The complicated version says the goal was not just labor. The complicated version says there were people in the 16th century who understood exactly what they were destroying and destroyed it anyway. And the complicated version says that destruction was never as complete as those who ordered it hoped. Because you are here. Here we are. Still asking the questions, still following the maps, still reading the documents they tried to keep buried. If you made it to the end of this video, you are exactly the kind of person who history needs right now. Not someone who accepts the easy version, someone who wants to know what actually happened. So share this video with one person you think needs to see it. Leave a comment below with the question this raised for you, because I read every single one. And subscribe, because we are just getting started. There are more documents in that archive, more maps, more names, and we are going to find every single one. The history of Africa is not a footnote. It is not a tragedy to be pitied and moved past. It is the foundation of the modern world, and it is still being written. Thank you for watching.